Good morning, my friends. My name is Kevin Clarke, and I'm the deputy leader of the Ontario People's Political Party and your candidate for Toronto Mayor. Yes, I am the opposition to Mr. Tory and the opposition to Mr. Ford. It is ironic that I become the opposition to both of them because I was supposed to face both of them for the mayor of Toronto's job in 2018. But Doug Ford ended up trumping that by becoming Premier of Ontario. I will give you a little history of myself and Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford has a brother named Rob Ford. In 2010, there was a meeting held in one of the media outlets in the city of Toronto after a shocking poll was put forth by a subsidiary of the Toronto Star called iWeekly magazine. iWeekly and its editor, Mr. Edward Keenan, did a poll of the top 5 candidates to be mayor. And in that poll, they came up with 5 individuals. Number 1 was David Miller, who was the current mayor of Toronto. Number 2 was George Smitherman, who was the former health minister in the Liberal government that got involved in $1 million or $1 billion boondoggle in reference to health care, and he was the former health minister. Number 3 was former TTC chair Karen Stint. And the number 4 candidate to be mayor of Toronto was a man named John Tory. But there was a 5th candidate. And that 5th candidate's name you will see right there, a man named Kevin Clarke. Now, Mr. Keenan and the Star, they felt that they could not exclude Kevin Clarke because he was clearly in the front-running race, because Mr. Clarke, being a former homeless man, placed 7th place out of 26 candidates against Melvin Douglas Lastman, the former mayor of North York and the first mayor of the mega city called Toronto. The mega city came together through the amalgamation of 6 municipalities: the municipality of Etobicoke, the municipality of York, the municipality of East York, which was the largest borough or the only borough in Canada, the municipality of the former city of Toronto, and what's the 2 others? There was East York, North York, East York, North York, Etobicoke, York, the municipality of Toronto, and the municipality of Scarborough. Those 6 municipalities were put together in amalgamation, and it formed one mega city called the City of Toronto. Now, when Mr. Keenan did this article, he had put odds on what's the odds of these people winning. And the odds, I think, was 2-1. David Miller, 5-1. Karen Stint, 10-1. Or George Smitherman, 25-1. John Tory, and 1,000,000-1. Kevin Clarke. But that wasn't the matter. The matter was that Mr. Clarke was still polled in the top 5 candidates. But he didn't give him good odds to win because he was a former homeless man, an ex-con, an ex-drug dealer, an ex-pimp. So, an ex-drug addict rose from the streets of Toronto to be polled in the top 5 for mayor in 2010. When it came time for the mayoral race, from what I was told by people who were on the inside, a meeting was held at City TV, and the question was, are we going to push Kevin Clarke? He's got the biggest social value. He's the only one who's really a socialist, like really into social issues. But then the question came out, can we control Clarke? Will Clarke serve the media agenda? So in their discussion, they decided that Clarke can't be controlled. Can't be controlled by the media, can't be controlled by the corporation, can't be controlled by the status quo. He's only controlled by the people. So a decision was made to bring in a man named Rob Ford. At that point, Rob Ford was a city councilor in Etobicoke, and he was a very popular city councilor. Kevin Clarke had enormous popularity among those who knew him, but only few got to hear about Kevin Clarke because he never got any media press. So when Mr. Ford rose up, Mr. Clarke became the number one nemesis to Rob Ford. Everywhere Rob Ford went, Kevin Clarke showed up. And Rob Ford was a very respectful politician because Rob Ford didn't do like what many of Mr. Clarke's opponents have done, as you can find on the internet by Googling Kevin Clarke. Mr. Ford faced Kevin Clarke, but he used shrewd method. So Mr. Ford will always see that he goes to events where there was always a private property close by. So knowing that Kevin Clarke was of low financial resources, Mr. Ford's team would scope out a transit entrance. How does transit get into area where debates or functions Mr. Ford were going to be at? So like, for example, when they're at the Art Gallery of Ontario, they would make sure there was a private parking lot, that if Kevin Clarke show up, Rob Ford can duck into the private parking lot, and then they can use security to tell Mr. Clarke that he's trespassing on private property, right? Same thing with the Art Gallery of Ontario. So they would not invite Mr. Clarke, but if he show up, they'll tell him he was trespassing. As the election goes through, Rob Ford gained light as to what was happening. And Rob Ford and Kevin Clarke did battle right across Scarborough, right across the city. And when you get down to the end of the election, well, I'm going to tell you a story about Rob Ford. There was a debate in Scarborough Civic Center, and the city was on edge because Kevin Clarke had announced that he's coming to Scarborough, and he's coming to do battle with Rob Ford, and he's coming to take Rob Ford out. So they had invited a few of the so-called French candidates, and one of them was Kevin Clarke. And then they had invited a media-created front runners, which was Giorgio Mamaletti, Joe Pantalone, Sarah Thompson, Karen Stent, and Karen Stent did earn her qualifications to be there because she's a former GTC chair, and she was a well-loved city councilor, and Rob Ford. The entrance of each part of the auditorium was jam-packed with security behind wherever Kevin Clarke was sitting. And they knew that there was going to be a collision course between Rob Ford and Kevin Clarke. And they knew that it was going to be fireworks because at that period of time, Kevin Clarke was the most vibrant, the most vocal, and he was the most flamboyant candidate you have ever seen. So in the debate in Scarborough, all the supposed front runners got to speak. And then it was time for Mr. Clarke to speak and for the few other candidates they invited. And the moderator put on the announcement that says, we're asking those candidates who are front runners who speak if they could stay in the room or come by and listen to these other candidates out of respect for them. Karen Stent, Giorgio Mamaletti, Joe Pantalone, all the other candidates left the stage. But while the so-called French candidates were speaking, a man walked back in the room and sat down in front of his can of Coke. And that man was Rob Ford. So at that period of time, security was all on the edge when Kevin Clarke got up and he approached Rob Ford for their first confrontation. And he said, security ready to rush. But Mr. Clarke says, you know something, Rob? I came here to hammer your house. I came here to put you out of this race. But you get away tonight, Rob, because you gave respect to the other candidates and you legitimized their candidacy for mayor of Toronto. And I have to give you respect for respecting others. So security back off with Mr. Clarke, back off Mr. Ford, and gave an exceptional speech. The election went through and they attacked and they pushed Rob Ford, and Rob Ford did earn the job, even though he was placed there in front of me. And when the votes came in, Rob Ford was mayor. Right throughout the summer, while we were campaigning, We had constant communication with Rob Ford's office on homelessness and other social issues. So Rob Ford had my phone number. On the morning of October, the morning after Rob Ford was elected to the highest office in Toronto, the largest city in Canada, a former homeless man, because during the election, Mr. Clarke got ousted. But this former homeless man received a call on his cell phone. And the individual says, "Good morning." He says, "Good morning, how are you?" He says, "Kevin." "Yeah, it's Rob." "Rob who?" "Rob Ford." At that period of time, Mr. Clarke semi-snaps. He was a little still not awake. He says, "Rob, what are you doing calling me? You were just elected mayor of Toronto." He says, "Well, Kevin, I'm returning your call." Now we know that that was bull crap, because Rob Ford ain't going to be returning messages from during the campaign, even though Rob Ford was great at returning messages. So at that period of time, Mr. Clarke uttered and said, "Rob, you're calling me because you knew what was going to happen. You knew that you were put in place instead of me, and your conscience take a hold of you." And that was basically it. Why else would a mayor, a man who was elected to the highest office in the city for the largest city, call a homeless man within 24 hours after being elected? So as the years go by, I put the pressure on Rob Ford, because I told Rob Ford, I says, "If you were put in to replace me, then, buddy, you're going to be like me. Not on the issues that you put forth, because you must have put forth good issues for you to have been voted in as my substitute. But I'm going to make you the best mayor this city will ever have, and this country will ever have." And that's why I was so hard on Rob Ford, because if Rob Ford was put in there to replace me, he's going to be damn good. He's going to be the best mayor this city ever had. And I worked hard as hell to make Rob Ford the best mayor there ever is. But his unseen demons, which is understandable due to the type of generosity Rob Ford had taken a hold of him. So after Rob's passing, there was an election held in Etobicoke. And Michael Ford, Rob Ford's nephew, seeked the appointment. And Kevin Clarke also seek to replace Rob Ford as Rob Ford's successor. Mr. Clarke had vowed that he's coming to Etobicoke and he's coming to take out Michael Ford. Mr. Clarke went to Etobicoke. Michael Ford was shocked. Michael Ford was the first one to jump up and shake Mr. Clarke's hands. And then the debate went. Mr. Clarke did his work and the whole thing, and was ready to go back to Scarborough. As he was passing through the church parking lot, Mr. Clarke, who was poked in the eyes when he was a child, so he has extreme issues with his eyes, and he's more than 50% blind. He heard his name, and Mr. Clarke looked up, but he still couldn't recognize who it was. And then a man with a blonde hair came running towards him to shake his hands and said, "Mr. Clarke, I just had to meet you, and I had to just tell you, my brother Rob, he had the utmost respect for you." And then Doug gave Kevin Clarke a business card and says, "Anything you ever need, just give me a call." I will be calling in Mr. Ford on that, and I'd love to call it in on coronavirus, but I can't. I have an obligation to a 7-year-old child named Caitlin Sampson, who was murdered in Parkdale. And my obligation is to see that there is justice for Caitlin and there's children's rights in Ontario. So I will be calling Doug Ford on that promise, but I will be calling it on children's rights, and I will be calling him to give a report and to enact the 173 recommendation of the Caitlin Sampson inquest into the death of this 7-year-old child. Cynthia Mulligan from City TV can confirm many of this information I give you, and so can other media outlets if they do their work. So that is what I'm going to call Doug Ford on children's rights in the death of 7-year-old Caitlin Sampson. But on the coronavirus crisis, Mr. Ford has dropped the ball. My interim leader currently, our deputy leader, Mr. Troy J. Young, had written a letter to Mr. Ford at the start of the coronavirus. And it told Mr. Ford that the way to stop the spread of the COVID-19 was for you to first house the homeless. So rather than you leaving it up to the city of Toronto, the province have to now get in. Because if everybody's isolated and being quarantined and the homeless are not being isolated and quarantined, when everyone comes out of isolation and quarantine, they're naturally going to run across homeless people because there's 5,000 to 10,000 in the province and you can't get around them. So if they're not isolated or quarantined, now the whole general public will be exposed. We also brought up an issue of the law enforcement not wearing masks when they're interacting with homeless people who have not been quarantined and has not been isolated. Those letters were ignored by Mr. Ford's office. So we fast forward now to the current day of the corona crisis. Mr. Ford has done thousands and thousands and thousands of tests on Ontarians. But Mr. Ford, we would like to know, those who are positive, what have you done to keep them away from those who have not been tested? So, for example, rather than telling people to stay at home, don't go visit your family, don't go visit anyone else, Mr. Ford should have said, go visit your family, go visit your friends, go visit that senior in need, go visit that person who is disabled, who needs someone to help them. But what I'm asking you as Premier is, since you have been tested and you have come back negative, I am asking you that you encourage these people you're going to visit to get tested before you visit them. And if it's a negative test, we're asking that you ensure that they self-isolate for 14 days and that they quarantine. And after they do that, then feel free to go visit them. So now we know that all those who are interacting are people with negative tests. And then Mr. Ford should have gone to those who were negative and says, we're asking you to wear a mask. And if the mask worked, and if that was acceptable to their health condition, and it did not cause any problem, but if you are unable to wear a mask, we're asking you to social distance. That way you'll be 6 feet away from those who have not been tested or those who are positive for the virus or those who possibly can spread the virus who have been out of the country. Once we do that, then we can work at tracking those people who have not been tested. And when we track those people who have not been tested, we can break down the possible sites and the possible spread of the virus. And then we can focus and isolate on the virus. Mr. Ford did not do that. Mr. Ford turned the stopping the spread of the virus into building an economic crisis, building a health care crisis. This is what has happened due to the actions of Mr. Ford and his government. And in hindsight, you can condemn Mr. Ford, but we cannot blame Mr. Ford because he seemed to have been trying at the start. But then Mr. Ford came into his emergency order. And then Mr. Ford got into the mentality of dictatorship. If you've ever heard the saying, power corrupts, well, Mr. Ford at that point felt powerful. And in turn, Mr. Ford overdid what needed to be done on the economy, what needed to be done on health care, and he undermined what was being done in our testing system. And that is why now we're at this state that we are at. Mr. Ford has turned Ontarians against each other because of his zest for power and dictatorship that eventually led to grave negligence in stopping the spread of the coronavirus. We look to turn back that clock of time. So the Ontario People's Political Party, since we are the People's Party, the real People's Party, not Maxime Bernier's farce, the watchdog of the people and government. If you had noticed when this party was formed, we are a non-political political party formed to be the people's watchdog on government. So we are here, and we are on top of your government, and we will be calling out Mr. Ford, and we will be encouraging Mr. Ford to start taking the advice of the experts, such as myself and Mr. Troy J. Young and other party leaders in Ontario, so we can stop the spread of the coronavirus. I want you all to have a Merry Christmas and a happy celebration of the birth of Christ. And I want you all not to have no fear and to love and share, to realize God is life and life is good, because life gives us an opportunity to love, an opportunity to give hope, an opportunity to live in peace, and an opportunity to bring justice for all. And the focus of life is for us to bring joy and happiness to one another. And we do that through loving kindness. And if you don't believe in God, I do. So the glory belongs to God naturally. But the glory also belongs to that is good. So let's work together. Let's love one another. And if you have been tested for the virus and the Ford government feels you should be tested, then let's change the Ford government policy to where we encourage people to visit family members, to visit loved ones, to visit seniors, to visit disabled, to visit those less fortunate. If you have a negative test, what we ask that if you have a negative test and you visit those people, that you do wear a mask. And if you are wearing a mask, you don't need to social distance, right? But if you're not wearing a mask, to social distance. But we're also asking you for one thing else. We're asking you to help us stop the spread of the virus. So for those who you choose to visit, we're asking you to encourage them to get tested. And once all is negative, then you can interact as you normally did before the coronavirus came to town. I'm Kevin Clarke. I am not only your candidate for mayor, I am the deputy leader of the Ontario People's Political Party. Let's rid Toronto, Ontario, and eventually Canada of the threats of the coronavirus. Let's make Toronto good again. Make Ontario great. And then Canada can eventually be a super place for us all to plant a good seed of hope through peace and love in this garden of life. Peace be to all. And I do truly love all of you.